For today's video, we'll be looking at an obscure ship, one even less known than the last video this week, HMS Wimbrel, because we'll be returning to the Pacific and to American destroyers, but not to one of the big names. Today's video will, instead, cover USS Norman Scott, one of relatively few ships named for a man who was lost in the same conflict the ship served in. In this case for Admiral Scott, lost off Guadalcanal. As you could probably expect, that means USS Norman Scott entered service relatively late. In spite of a pretty insane construction pace, the ship would miss most of the major actions. Although this is not to say the ship lacks interesting stories. Far from it, especially with how short her active service really was. Let's get into that now. As always, Norman Scott's story began when the ship was laid down, in this case on April 26, 1943, in Bath Iron Works. That yard gained something of a reputation for pumping out destroyers at a rapid pace. Scott would be no different. The ship was launched 4 months after her keel was laid on August 28, 1943. The fitting out went just as quickly. USS Norman Scott was commissioned on November 5, 1943, a little under 7 months from keel laying to commissioning, which is certainly impressive, don't get me wrong, but that was also quite late into the war, for better or worse. However, before that, a brief overview on the ship's design. As a Fletcher-class destroyer, Scott displaced around 2,100 tons at her standard loading, at least as designed. By the time Scott entered service, this would likely have increased to some extent. Similarly, the full load was closer to 2,800 tons than the design 2,500. On that displacement, the ship carried the typical Fletcher weapon layout. 5 5-inch 38 caliber guns in single mountings. 127mm for the metric audience. These were carried in 2 super-firing pairs, one on the bow and one on the stern, with the 5th mount carried just ahead of the aft pair, facing forward. A heavy broadside, although not the heaviest fitted to a contemporary destroyer. To support those, Scott also carried a mix of 40mm Bofors and 20mm cannon, as was typical by this point of the war. The exact number varied between ships and time period, but an average would be 10 40mm Bofors in 5 twin mounts, and 7 single 20mm cannon. The main hitting power, however, came from the torpedoes. Fletchers, as initially designed, carried 2 quintuple mounts amidships, for a total of 10 torpedoes between the 2 5-tube launchers. Scott is interesting in that she retained all 10 torpedoes in spite of a major overhaul in late 1944. But we'll get to that later. Regardless, the ship's weaponry was rounded off by depth charges on the stern, and all of this equipment could reach around 35 to 36 knots on average. Fletchers were ostensibly capable of 38 knots, but Friedman notes the rapid increase in displacement slowed them down a bit. So 35 to 36 was the more typical speed at full loading. In any event, with that covered, we can return to service, which in this case is short but exciting. As mentioned earlier, Scott commissioned on November 5, 1943. However, the usual training and working up phase would keep her in home waters for a couple months. As a result, the destroyer only left the East Coast on January 14, 1944. This involved escorting USS Canberra to Pearl Harbor, where both ships would arrive on February 1st. And then the destroyer was immediately sent out into the war on escort duty, in this case guarding USS Gambier Bay on a trip to the Marshall Islands. I covered this mission in my video on Gambier Bay, but in simple terms, it was a typical escort carrier ferry run in March of 1944, delivering a group of aircraft to USS Enterprise off Majuro. Norman Scott escorted Gambier Bay without issue before returning to Pearl Harbor. To prepare for actual combat service, in support of the Marianas invasion. Quite late in the conflict to be seeing her first action, but that's to be expected with such a late entry to service. Regardless, Scott set out once more. She departed Hawaii to escort the battleships as they bombarded the Marianas, beginning with Saipan in the middle of June, specifically June 15th, as you can see here from a battle plan. From all indications, this went without issue for Norman Scott. That would change catastrophically when the destroyer shifted to Tinian. While supporting the invasion on July 24th, Scott would suffer heavy damage. The Japanese had hidden 3 6-inch guns, apparently taken from British stock at Singapore, very well. This battery had evaded destruction during the entire pre-invasion bombardment. And now the Japanese chose to expose their position to fire on the bombardment force, specifically USS Colorado. That battleship had closed in to 3,000 yards from shore, and the Japanese took full advantage. The 3 6-inch guns opened fire and quickly found the range. By 7:40 a.m. on July 24th, 1944, they began landing hits. Colorado would ultimately suffer 22 hits, and while the guns weren't capable of penetrating her main belt, they did plenty of damage to the upper works and other less armored areas. 43 men were killed and 198 wounded. The captain of USS Norman Scott, watching this happen, made a decision. His ship, even closer to shore, 1,800 yards, moved to draw fire from Colorado. This worked. However, it can be argued that it worked too well, because Scott did draw fire, specifically 6 shells, within 15 minutes. Those 6-inch rounds slammed into the destroyer and caused severe damage. 1 shell hit the bridge, killing the captain, Seymour Owens, and the rest of the bridge crew. Owens would have a gearing named after him, although that ship was never completed. The other shells, meanwhile, peppered the ship, from the bridge all the way back to the stern. There's an image on screen listing the hits, but to cover it vocally, the bridge was hit, as I said already. Another hit came to the side, just below the superstructure, and a bit further aft. The third shell punched through the top of the forward funnel, while the fourth hit the bottom of the aft funnel. The fifth shell hit the aft torpedo tubes, which makes it very fortunate Scott didn't blow up. And the sixth and final shell punched into the number 5 gun mount. The picture of this damage is striking, to say the least. There were also, evidently, issues with ammunition and secondary detonations. NavSource has the full damage report, and I'll link that in the description for those interested. It makes for interesting, if rather morbid, reading. In any case, Norman Scott continued to fire ashore, even as USS Cleveland moved in to take the fire off of her and Colorado. Cleveland would fire so much, and so quickly, that the ship was covered in smoke, and concerned officers on USS Birmingham enough to report Cleveland hit as well. She wasn't, as it turned out, and the cruiser's action allowed Scott to survive the engagement, although the Japanese battery would only be destroyed by USS Tennessee on July 28th. As for USS Norman Scott, she lost 22 of her crew, with a further 50 wounded, although you'll also see varying numbers from 19 deaths to 23, and from 50 wounded to 57 or 63. No matter how many crew lost their lives, the ship remained afloat. Scott pulled back from the action, with temporary repair work performed at Saipan, before she then set off on July 28th for proper repairs. This took place at the Mare Island shipyard, lasting until October 21st, 1944. Apparently, the ship was featured in a film about American Navy yards during this process. As for her wartime service, this was mostly quiet after the ship returned to duty. Scott departed California to train off Hawaii. Eagle-eyed viewers will, of course, note that this is late October 1944. This means that Norman Scott was training while the Battle of Leyte Gulf was raging. You can see why her engagement at Tinian is the most exciting event in this ship's service. After the training in Hawaii concluded, Scott returned to the front lines. She would escort convoys to the Philippines until February 9th, 1945. Quiet duty, but good for working up the crew. Because when that was done, Scott joined up with the fast carriers for raiding into Japanese waters. This included the air raids on Iwo Jima and Okinawa, after which she would join up with the fast battleships. This saw Norman Scott sail with 3 out of 4 Iowas on July 15, 1945. Only New Jersey was missing. As for their mission, simple: to close in and bombard Hokkaido. Because by this point of the war, shore bombardment of Japan was possible, at least in less defended areas. This would make USS Norman Scott one of the first ships to bombard the Japanese home islands. It would also be her last major operation. Scott would help support the occupation of Japan after the Japanese surrender in August of 1945. She then returned home, arriving on the West Coast on October 27th. Her active post-war career would prove very short. After returning home, Scott operated out of San Francisco for a little while, before being decommissioned on April 30th, 1946. Norman Scott was placed in the reserve fleet and would remain there for the rest of her time afloat. The destroyer was never recommissioned or sold to a foreign power. She simply languished in reserve from 1946 all the way to 1973, before being stricken on April 15, 1973, and sold for scrap on December 3rd of the same year. USS Norman Scott's active service was short, but she certainly had an exciting time of things for what it was. It's a shame that the vast majority of her time was spent in reserve. But, well, the Navy had no shortage of Fletchers. Thank you for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe if you enjoy the content, and I'll see you in the next one.